Well, welcome back. For those of you who have been watching with us, thank you. We're glad that you're back with us again. This is a study. If you're just tuning in and you saw this one, you clicked on it and you started, I just want you to know that you're in the middle of a series on the Gospel of John, something that this group of brothers and teachers and I have been going through now for, 5 or 6 weeks at least, and plan to continue to go through until we conclude with John 17. And so today we will be in John 15, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before we do, whether you're someone from our church, from Westside Church of Christ, or someone in the community, or anywhere across the globe, I guess, that's tuning into this, I just wanted to, one of the things I've been wondering is how you're using this teaching. Are you doing this as a personal study, just yourself, or maybe you and a friend or a spouse, maybe maybe even with your kids, or are you doing this with a small group or some kind of a study group? And one of the things I want to encourage you to do, because this is not live, is to use that to customize your study and use that to your advantage. So if you're watching this at home and you get to a place where we've read something, or you want to read some more, or you haven't read it for yourself, just hit pause and read it. If you'd like to have some discussion around this as we discuss, if you'd like to stop and have some prayer time in that, whatever it is, customize this and use this kind of format that we're doing to your advantage. And so I'd like to encourage everyone to do that, as this is still kind of an experimental thing that we're doing, but having a lot of fun and really learning a lot. And we hope that you're learning a lot as well. So, as I said, today we'll be covering John 15, the first 8 verses. So it's a pretty tight-knit passage. It's really it's got a lot in a small amount, and so I'm going to read the passage for us in full today, and then what I'm going to do is go back through, and we're going to kind of go through mostly verse by verse and break that down, and my awesome panel of brothers here and great teachers are going to help us really dig deep into this text. And so once again, thanks for being a part of it today. So if you have your Bible available, I'm going to start here in John 15. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does not bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. Okay, well, before we get into our verses and I ask for some help here and some thoughts, I mentioned this last time whenever we talked about this coming up, that Jesus here clearly is using this metaphor of a vine dresser, this vineyard kind of feel. And I don't know for you at home, those of you, maybe you have more experience, maybe you've grown up around a vineyard or in a place where they had vineyards. I did not. Growing up in Northeast Texas around me, if there were vineyards, I was not aware of them. And so as I think about vines, so just the mental image that comes to mind when I think about a vine is those little pesky things that like grow up on the side of your house, or something, or poison ivy or something like that. That's what I think about, these little thin vines. That is not at all the imagery that Jesus is explaining when he talks about vine dressing, as it correlates with vineyards and grapes and those kinds of things. And so I wanted to the best of my ability, since I had not grown up around that, educate myself a little bit. So I've read some and watched some videos online to to try to get an idea of what it's like to be a vine dresser, what it's like to manage a vineyard. And as I did that, I saw one video in particular really gave me I'm a visual learner, and it helped me to actually see. So there was a video I found on YouTube or somewhere that helped me see that a vineyard, in a vineyard setting, this vine that I was thinking of little small vines is actually a very big, thick piece of like wooden looking structure, right? It just goes across and it's large, especially a mature vineyard, a vine. And so you could see at all different stages in the maturation of a vineyard. They have the ones that have been there for a long time, and those with this large vine, if you could picture that, are these shoots that come off of it. And so here Jesus is, and we're going to get into this, is talking about being the vine. It's this kind of hardy thing, right? And then there's these branches that grow off of it, and on those branches is actually where the fruit comes out. It's off these shoots. And so with that kind of just general, we won't get any further because I'm sure my colleagues here are going to have some extra things to bring up, but maybe that'll give you a little bit of a backdrop as we get a little more into this. So I'm just gonna actually start with the first two verses, and I'm gonna ask for some feedback here. So, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. So we have two kind of starting off just this theme of Jesus saying, I am the vine, and he says, my Father is the vine dresser. And then we get into this kind of concept of pruning. So somebody would like to chime in on that.
Some of the commentaries that I read are typically written in the late 19th century or even early to mid 20th century. That's just how the people I like to read. And they make a big deal out of Jesus saying the true vine, because in the Old Testament, the Jews thought of themselves, the Jews, as the vine. And they also think of God as being the owner of the vineyard rather than the vine dresser, who is a different person. And so that they made a big deal out of the fact that Jesus said the true vine. I thought that was quite interesting because he is contrasting what they would have understood. The other thing that I noticed is if you go back up to the last verse of 14, it says, rise, let us go from here. So they are leaving the building and they're walking, we know, to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is an olive garden. But to get there, they have to cross a valley. And in that valley was a vineyard. So he's using the things that they are looking at themselves as examples.
That's great.
I really like that God is the kind of the owner and the doer, and Jesus is the heart of it. I think he kind of puts everyone in their place, right? And so there's not this, well, I'm going to run the show, or I'm going to be the main part of the show even. At best, I'm going to be a fruitful piece. And so that's what kind of jumped out to me first is Jesus kind of stacks it out that way. And growing up a few years in Mississippi, we had muscadines. And so they had large vines. And I know every type of species of plant's a little different, but some things will not grow fruit on first year pieces of the plant. So it's that kind of interesting thing that it takes some maturity, it takes some doing things right, and you might not know that it's doing right until much later. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, along that lines, Ben, when I was growing up, being raised on a farm, one of the things that we raised a lot of were strawberries, and we had acres and acres of strawberries that were taken to market, and anytime we would plant a new set of strawberry plants, that first year you would take the blossoms off, and it's so that the plant would put more of its energy, if you will. I'm not a plant person necessarily, but into strengthening the plant, making runners so that it produces more plants and more sections, and rather than trying to put on strawberries. And so that's sort of my vision of this pruning, because we did have apple trees and peach trees and things like that, but didn't have a vineyard, but we had strawberries. And to me, that's a part of the pruning, is basically removing that so that long term the plants could become much more productive and produce more and better fruit.
I think the other thing that's interesting in here is that the Father is the one doing the pruning, and what's interesting to me about that is often in our church culture, we think it is our job to do the pruning. And so when someone we deem is not bearing fruit, then it is our job to remove them from the system, right? And we know from Matthew 18 that Jesus does outline a disciplinary process for us and so forth. But I think it's important that we remember that it's really God who does all of this. God is the one, the Father is the one who is purifying us, strengthening us, sustaining us in the Son. And He is the one who decides, you are not bearing the fruit of the Son. It is time for you to be removed from this situation.
So right off the bat here, we see that one of the neat things that we've kind of alluded to is Jesus saying, I'm the true vine and my Father. So there's a kind of a separation between Jesus and the Father here. And this is going to be an ongoing thing that we talk about throughout our study, God being in three persons, right, and three parts. The way I try to explain that to my kids is with an egg. An egg has a shell and a yolk and it's not perfect, but it kind of works because it's a hard thing to understand. But there are different roles that they play, and so we get that. And then Marcus, did you have something to add either on that or on the pruning process?
I was just applauding you for using proper Trinitarian language.
Oh, okay.
So I'm over here like, good, so Josh isn't a heretic and we can move on with this class. That's good. One of the things that strikes me about this passage actually is in John, we often will focus on what we begin with here in chapter 15, which is the I am statements. I am the true vine. But you brought it up well, I think both Ben and Zach, to talk about how there's distinct roles. Josh, you've nailed it down, but it talked about some of what the Father's role is. And so Zach, as you were talking, I could only help but think of just after the honor roll of faith that comes in Hebrews 11, in chapter 12, the fact that there's talk about how God disciplines those He loves, those that He calls children. He works to improve and to refine those same children whom He loves. And then what's more is, we've mentioned it many times before, but that last bit in Philippians 2, just after that lovely Christ hymn, it talks about how God is the one who is at work to both will and to work within us. And so I can see that here as each of those roles, like Ben was talking about, are kind of distinguished. A lot of work is being done on God's part for us in our participation in this vine. And so I think we'll unpack that a little bit more on how it goes down, but it's interesting to me that the growing part is there, and it's talked about in terms of Christ, and the Father is the one who's at work to improve and to do within that situation. And so, there's definitely a lot here that is going to speak really well into how we develop spiritually. Absolutely.
I think it still goes back to that vineyard language that we don't really understand, that I looked at some of the original language in verse 2 where it says takes away in our ESV. That in many places is lifted up. And so if you are in a vineyard and you have the branches that are growing down toward the ground, they do not produce fruit as well. So the vine dresser goes in and he lifts them up. He ties them to a place where they will be more productive. So it's not just about us being cut away from God if we're not productive, but if we're not productive enough, He lifts us up to a new place where we can be more productive.
Yeah, I think that's a good way, James, to bring kind of a pause. I think sometimes, anytime, I know it's like anything, when you read a passage, depending on where you are in your own spiritual maturity and your own life experiences, you can take it kind of with a negative or kind of a positive context. And I think that, at least the way I read this, it's more of a positive. This pruning process is a positive thing. It might not sound that way if you were to read this and think about, where he says, hey, if you're not bearing fruit, then you're going to get pruned. So, but why? Why are you getting pruned? So you can do what? Bear more fruit. right, which is a good thing. So this pruning process in life is something that's actually healthy for us, just like it is for a plant.
Absolutely. One of the things, it just struck me as you were talking about that lifted up nature. So back earlier in chapter 12, there's this passage that maybe we might be familiar with, but in chapter 12, verse 32, it says, "And I," Jesus speaking, "when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." In a similar way to all these branches that are going to be talked about are incorporated in some way into the vine. But it's interesting there, even the word there for draw, kind of, I'm thinking of that image of someone picking up a vine off the ground and kind of placing it higher on whatever bough it's on, you know. But that word for draw is a lot stronger in the Greek, and it really is a word that means drag. Like, I will just really lift them up off the ground. And so I can feel some of the force here in terms of what's being talked about in terms of lifting up, the kind of desire that God has for us to see us fruitful and to produce.
So I think for me, one of the things that this speaks to is God's investment in us, and we've kind of been talking about this, but I am a person who, if I struggle with anything when it comes to believing in God, it's believing that God cares and He's close. So the technical term for that is deism. I have no problem believing there is a God, but it's whether or not He cares about me and what I'm doing, and about us as a church and what we're doing, because He feels far off, right? But the imagery that Jesus leaves us with of the Father and of Himself is not of a God who is far off, just letting the world run on its own devices. He's also leaving us with an image that doesn't say that He's like micromanaging. The fruit is still doing its own thing, but what He is doing is cultivating and investing and encouraging and lifting up and getting rid of when it's necessary. And I think one of the things that John is trying to do here, anytime we see imagery that involves like a tree or a plant, the authors of the Bible are trying to kick us back to Genesis. And they're trying to remind us of the imagery of the garden, of the work that, so if we think about Genesis chapter 1, God creates all the things, and he builds man, puts man in the garden, and calls them to go and cultivate it. But the one tree that they're not supposed to go cultivate or do anything with is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? But there's another tree, a tree of life, and they draw sustenance from that tree. And when man fails, ultimately they are cut off from both of those trees. They're cut off from the knowledge of good and evil, but more importantly, they are removed or separated from the tree of life that is providing their sustenance. And really the imagery there of Eden is kind of this centrifugal area where the trees, those two trees are in the center. And everything comes from outside of them, is drawn to and draws from them, including mankind. And so Jesus here is trying to kick us back to that imagery. And the imagery that Marcus just brought up, the being lifted up, is invoking the cross imagery that will come later. But the cross is a tree. Jesus becomes the tree of life on the cross. And so here in this, he's setting the stage for that by reminding us that our sustenance, our joy, our abilities, the fruit that we'll come to later, comes from our connection to the tree of life, which we know to be Jesus.
Right.
And I agree with you. And I think if we think about his Jewish audience, now he's talking to Jewish men who follow him and believe him to be the Messiah, but he's telling them just being a son of Abraham is not enough. You must be connected. You have to get sustenance from God. So you have to be connected to God directly, or as directly as you can be, which in this case is Jesus.
Let's keep reading, and anything that from past verses keep bringing into it. But I know that this is kind of where we're going. So I'm going to go 3 and 4 together, and let's keep reading. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. All right, Marcus?
Yeah, I need a little sign that we can bring to future sessions, perhaps, that says how many days it's been since I've gone without a Greek reference in one of these classes, and it's going
Hey,
to
bring 'em
never
on.
be erased from,
That would
from
be
the
a
zero
very
mark.
negative sign.
Yeah, exactly. So, and James, actually, you pointed this out earlier, and I just want to complete kind of the triad that's there almost. So, James had pointed out in verse 2 how it talks about every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And that's a word that's to lift up. And so I'm going to say it out loud because you need to know it for this next reference I'm going to make. So that word is ire. You can say that with me, maybe. But that word is actually appended to a little prefix in these next couple of verses. So whenever it talks about every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, again in verse 2. That word for prunes is kathare, or katare, I should say. And then similarly, in verse 3, and if you're like me, you get a little disjointed whenever you read this third verse. It's like, okay, so we were talking about one analogy. Our analogy is one of growth, is one about plants, it's one about cultivation. But this one talks about cleaning, almost recalling in our minds back to chapter 13, which we actually reviewed this Sunday morning, if you're synchronous with us. But anyhow, so this word for clean in verse 3 is that same katare. So we know some English cognates for this word, so like catharsis or something like that you might think of, but it is an idea of cleansing or cleaning. And so that plays into what we're talking about with pruning. You're taking away something that is ill or sick in that plant, and you're cleaning it and you're making it new. But I just wanted to point that out because it really stakes in the idea of what James had brought up earlier is if we're talking about the way that the vine dresser regards the branches in this vine, how great is the Father's love for us that he would be the one that would lift us up, that he would be the one that cleans us and ultimately wants to see us fruitful, regardless of how many times we find ourselves on the ground or withering, as we'll see later, or any number of other things. This is the nature of God's love for us, is that he's always interested in those kinds of things to see us be fruitful in him.
So I like that idea of cleansing, going back to that, what I was saying about a positive, pruning doesn't always have a positive thought, but cleansing maybe a little bit more, but they all tie in together. Yeah, it's good.
Am I the only one that finds verse 3 like, why is this here? So it's kind of it seems like an odd verse. We're talking about vines, and also we're talking about being clean. Perhaps a mild reference back to chapter 13 and what he's done with the washing of the feet. But I think I agree with what one of the commentators I read said, that the purpose of this is for Jesus to help establish the fact that the disciples and followers of Christ are already grafted into this vine. We're already connected to this. This is not a future, one day you will be a part of the vine, or maybe you will become a branch. It is Jesus' way of saying that in him, you have been made part of the whole, because he has made us new and made us clean, and you are now part of the vine. So if you're reading through this and you're wondering why is there this random verse about being clean amongst vine dressing and so forth, I think the connection there has to do with Jesus reminding his own apostles that your status is already in this vine. Through me, through the words that I have spoken and the actions I have already done for you, you are in this vine. And now you are being pruned and encouraged and reoriented and reshaped to bear the fruit that I am calling you to bear.
And, I mean, that's what I got from some of the commentaries I read as well, is that it's talking about how Jesus' words cleanse them. And then this morning, as Tim was talking, I went back to chapter 13, verse 17. He says, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I think it's really important for us to remember that, yes, God is doing the cleansing, but we have to stay connected. And that abiding or that connection, it demands a choice.
Yeah.
It demands us to choose to be connected.
I think you had brought that point up just earlier, Zach. And so I think another beautiful analogy, so another plant analogy, think to 1 Corinthians 3. There's the idea of believers being God's field, right? And so we know how that works. There's Paul and Apollos, and they have their own distinct roles within that. And then it says at the end that God ultimately is the one who causes the growth. Now, however, one of the other things that it says there is that we are fellow workers with God. It'll say fellow workers, co-workers. The word there is a word that we get synergy from. And so the idea is there is no separation, indeed, between our actions and God's willing and activity to make us grow. Like, both of those things are aligned in their purpose, and they're also aligned in their empowerment. All that comes from God. But our choosing and our acting doesn't preclude God's acting at the same time. So it's a beautiful thing that we get to do, to be completely and wholly in step with God.
Okay. We're gonna keep going, and once again, we'll have some time at the end to have, we're gonna have some big takeaways. I want to leave a little time for that. In verse 5, as you're gonna see, we're gonna continue in this thought of abiding, and that's another thing I want to cover with our group here, is just that word abide. So have that in your mind as we read verse 5 here, where it says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing.
I think Marcus needs a sign that says abide, because this was your word from the beginning, right? The idea of abiding, I think he needs a little flashy sign that anytime that comes, he can just push the button, that, ding, 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 Marcus's magic word. Which, it's really Jesus' magic word, but Marcus is helping us emphasize it. But what I love about this concept of abiding is the connectivity that it brings. Some of the imagery that Tim brought up this morning having to do with a baby being birthed. Abiding invokes that imagery as well, like a baby abides in the mother, just waiting to be brought forth. It's just this deep connection of relationship and interrelationship, and that's where this beautiful little last part of verse 6 comes out, where am I?
Verse 5.
5.
Yeah.
Sorry. That apart from me you can do nothing. If you want to kill a branch of a vine, just separate it from the main vine. It won't survive. If you want to help a branch that has been separated survive, you can graft it into the vine later, right? Like if you want to move a branch, say it's growing over here and you don't want it to grow over here, you can cut that branch, very carefully move it over and supplant it and graft it back into the vine, and it will regrow its connection and have sustenance to continue growing in whatever direction you've moved it.
It's one of the beautiful parts of that Eden reference you made earlier, is that even though they were cast out of the garden, they weren't cast out of God's love, were they? Right. They could continue to produce, and he still loved them, although there was some consequences for those actions.
Yeah, and I think he's trying to also remind us of what he said previously in chapter 14. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So our connection to the Father is through the vine, which is Jesus. And apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. So I think that's got to be our measure. This invokes the whole idea of what he said in chapter 13 of the way that you will know who I am is by the way that you love one another, the way that they will know that you belong to me. It's that connection. As we outpour the sustenance that Jesus gives us, that is what brings the fruit and the life and connects people back into that vine. It's the outflowing of the nutrient draw, to use the plant imagery, that is what brings people back into the fold. It is not us grafting them in.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that it's not go out and do something great. It's just stay with me. If we abide, if we are with Christ, and if you do that right and you don't hinder that spirit, great things are going to happen. The fruit's going to come. You're going to naturally grow. All these other things will be great. But that abiding, yeah, I really like that. He really just says, just stay with me. Just stay with me. That's all you got to do.
Yeah.
And in my mind, I'm always like, well, what do I got to do? I want to run over here. I want to go jump real high. Well, no, just stay with me. And it's kind of sticks it out that way. It's very, very beautiful to me.
Yeah, and I think these specifically, these couple of verses here, 4 and 5, are going to play into what I would like to kind of, with my closing takeaway, we're going to talk some more about that. James, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to say, in your positive negative thing,
Yeah.
My mind immediately went to Philippians 4:13, which we know in our culture is ultimately misused. But I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's what he's saying. He's saying, stay connected. And Paul says, hey, we can do whatever God needs us to do as long as we're connected to him.
Good point. Yeah, Daryl.
Yeah. So by now, if you've been watching our class, I usually love to come in and bring in something from the book of James, all right? Book of James. So
Greek, Marcus, James, Daryl. All right.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So in James 4, and I'm going to bring this up again later, but because of some of the things that James and Marcus and others have said, I think this fits in. So this is 4, 7 through 10. Submit yourself then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come near to God, and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. So, if people struggle, I think, with abiding with God, it's maybe you could use this and say it's really just humble yourselves and submit to God and draw his energy that he will give you to be able to resist the devil and those things. So
It's good. Guys, we got to keep moving. You keep holding on to that. We're going to get to verse 6 here. It's going to take a little bit of a shift, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on these last few, but this is a little different. He says in verse 6, if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered and thrown into the fire and burned. I thought we really needed to cover this, although we could, like anything, it's amazing that we're only going through chapters 13 through 17, but it still feels like we haven't scratched the surface sometimes. But what do you think about that? Because I think for a lot of us, at least from the background I grew up in, when you start talking about fire and burning, we get some pretty strong imagery there. What do you guys think about that?
I think I want to stay connected to the vine.
Amen.
It sounds way less painful.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think at face value, it's we hear from our upbringing the punishment for doing wrong, but honestly to me, that there is an option of free will, even in this analogy where I as a branch can run away from the vine. And I think it's just more of a, hey, don't do that because, and less of a, I'm going to burn you all. But yeah, there's an element of, you need the roots and you need the other branches and you need the other leaves, and kind of by yourself you can't do it.
So I think this connects really well back to the discussion we had about Judas in particular. So we had talked about kind of the natural progression of things as they head both one direction and the other. And your verse from James was the one that really had tied it together for us. The idea that if you're abiding and staying in something that is life-giving, it gives you life and life more abundantly, like we're seeing in this passage. And if you separate yourself from that life, you find yourself inevitably almost beyond your ability to will into death. And so that would be the case for these branches that are separated from the vine. And so in the end, there's still a purpose for these branches. And so the thing I wanted to address in this verse is, of course, the thing, I've heard this analogy, this parable, almost you could say, be used to talk specifically about those that are a part of the church body already, and so believers that are fallen away await some sort of very specific punishment. And I would say take it as you read it on face value of it. What that fire is not incredibly clear. We do have the sense that it's something where there's destruction involved, there's death involved, and there's perhaps punishment involved, but we don't know specifically what that is per se. But we do know that it is the effect of not abiding. So I think we can only do what Zach said and conclude that it's better for any to have abide rather than not.
Yeah, I think the whole purpose of this is not to explain what happens like hell or it's not trying to address that. The main imagery that it's trying to address is that in Jesus and in the vine is life, and apart from the vine is death. Doesn't really matter what that death looks like, how it comes about. Doesn't matter. It is life. But interesting thing about agronomy, we can run with this image a little bit. If you want to bring some life back to some soil that has drawn all the nutrients from it, one of the ways that you can do that is to burn it. So if you go out in a big field, we have a friend that's a wildlife biologist. Basically, he's a glorified pyromaniac. They like to go out and burn fields in the name of quail and other things. But what they're doing is they're saying all of this bad foliage has taken away the ability of the good foliage to grow up. So they'll go in and they'll run fire through it, and it clears it all out. It allows the root system that is already established to produce new fruit, but it also injects a ton of nutrients back into the soil. So I don't know if this is the primary point of all this, but I think one of the things that Jesus is reminding us is that even in the death of one who has lost connection to the vine, sustenance can come from that to those that remain connected to the vine.
Well, and I mean, if we look at the text, I put a box around every time the word abide showed up. It's like 10 times here. He's focused on abide. Mm-hmm. He does throw that verse in, and as we said, it's kind of take it at face value. Mm-hmm. Recognize that if you're not connected, there's danger, but abide.
Right. I'm going to read verses 7 and 8 together so we can kind of have a few more comments on that, and then we're really going to get into the big picture and kind of turn you guys loose here. So 7 says, if you abide, there we go again, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. That sounds another echo from something that we've covered recently, right? By this, my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples. Thoughts on that?
Hey, I got to bring up my James, right?
Go back.
James chapter 4.
Keep it flowing.
Let's see, what is that? Verses 2 through 4. You do not have because you do not ask. And this is going to come up again in John 15, right? So, and then he says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. So I think there's a whole series that could be talked about asking and receiving and what we would expect to receive. And I think sometimes we limit our asking because we don't expect we're going to receive.
Well, it was not that long ago when Jesus says basically, anything you ask, I think that might have been your section, Ben, that we've covered, anything you ask in mine. And then James pointed out that, this James, not your James, James Clements pointed out that was, the purpose was to glorify the Father. And what does the first part of verse 8 say right here? By this, my Father's glorified. So once again, there's a purpose for this when you ask. It's not just asking for frivolous things. There's a greater purpose that's being accomplished through that.
Well, I think here, it's not only that God is glorified, but that the fruit we bear glorifies God, because he's been talking about our fruit, and being fruitful. Mm-hmm. So the interesting thing that one of the commentators brought up is when we talk about fruit, the seed of the fruit produces more fruit. So that's I think where he's headed is God will not only be glorified in the 5-6 people on the stage, but whoever we affect will also have an opportunity to glorify God, and that seed will continue until Christ returns.
I think it's also a good, part of our discussion to interject. I mean, some things are as simple as they sound. I mean, for me, I'd like to know what this fruit we keep talking about is. Well, guess what? Galatians, it gives us something about that, doesn't it? I'm not even going to turn to it. Let's see if we can do it. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Thank you, Kids Song, for helping me get that all there. But a lot of times it is a very hard thing for us to understand, what kind of fruit are we talking about? What should I be looking for? How could that even be recognized? And I think one of the things is when we go through our processes of picking out leadership, elderships, and different things like that, that's the great place to start. Just where can you see that fruit in people's lives, right? Where do you see kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control? And that is found from abiding in Christ, in Jesus, right? Those are the things that just naturally flow. We had a lot of discussion when we talked about this last time, and it's kind of that faith versus works kind of thing, getting back to James, is, which comes first? And I think Zach made a good point that, when you are in Christ, that's what happens, right? It's not like I'm just going to try to, okay, today I need to be, maybe that's a good place to start. Maybe it's the fake it till you make it thing, right? But for the most part, you really want to get to a point to where you're just abiding in Christ, and then the fruit just starts showing up.
Yeah. So the important thing in Galatians and here is that the work that we do, the action steps of our faith to produce the fruit, is to pursue the Son, to abide in the Son, to draw our nutrients from the Son. If we want to bear more fruit, we don't go out and love more, peace more, self-control more. If I want more self-control, I don't pursue trying to be self-controlled. And anecdotal evidence from any of our lives could probably tell you that when you go out and try to do these things, you fail miserably at them, right? Like, I want to try and have more self-control about sugar. Good luck.
Give me patience and give it to me now.
Yeah.
Don't ask that. The work that we do to bear the fruit is to pursue Jesus. And that is clear in Galatians, and it's clear here that our fruit is a byproduct of our relationship with God and in community with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, who, incidentally, we've had all three of these occur in not necessarily this verse, but we've crossed over the Holy Spirit in chapter 14. We've learned what his role is. I think that's all important to the fact of what God is doing in his Son for us, is he is uniting us into the Trinitarian complex, so that God is no longer some sort of entity that exists apart from us, but rather we are intricately intertwined with the community that is God in three. And we're going to get to this more when we get to chapter 17, but it begins here with the vine. And that, notice, there is no distinction from the vine and the branches. They're all part of the same plant. The distinction is, are they bearing fruit or not? So are they drawing from Jesus or not? God determines that. God decides who needs a little bit of pruning and who needs to be chopped off and started over or just removed because they're causing problems. Mm-hmm. That's all God. Mm-hmm. Our job to bear the fruit is to pursue the Son. That's it.
So I'm going to get to my kind of key take, and we've already been dancing all around it. It's not anything new that we haven't been saying, but I'll kind of give you my big takeaway from reading through this and from the discussions we've had, and then you could add on to that or bring up some others that kind of branch off of that, if you will. You see what I did there? So for me, one of the things we've talked about the word abide and how many times it's used, and really this just even hit me later to go to the point I was already wanting to make with this. How many times does it say the two words back to back, in me? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 circled in 8 verses, and it's alluded to even more than that. In me. And so we've been talking in this series about love is. That's kind of our theme, And so love is in Jesus. in me. And that's what we've been saying over and over, this idea of connection, this idea of being connected to this power source. I had to teach this, or got to teach this, to our girls when we were doing some of the church at home stuff, and we worked through John. And I was trying to think of a way, because I told you how much vineyards were not just kind of a normal thing in my mind, even less so for my girls. And so what could I say that would help make this point? And I just kept going back to this idea of plugging in to a power source. They get that. They get that there's a lamp when I'm sitting there teaching sitting next to us, and that if that lamp isn't plugged in to the power source, that the lamp doesn't come on, right? And so when Jesus keeps going over in me, that's kind of what I take for this. Love is found, life is found, joy is found in Jesus. That's what he's saying here, is I'm the vine. Earlier he says that I am the way and the truth and the life, and that nobody can come to the Father through me. These things are just circulating all the time. It's the same thing he's saying in different ways. And it may be a little obvious, but it's not obvious, because how many times do we try to produce something on our own? And what will we produce if we're not connected to this power source? And we're going to be out there doing something with our time. Each day we get up, and if we're alive, we have to do something, and hopefully that's going to produce something. So that doesn't always look very good when it's not connected to the power source. And I notice in my life, whenever I go through times where I'm distracted, too many times we think this is only when I'm doing bad things or I'm in a really negative, bad place, and that's true. But it might just be in a time of apathy. It might just be in a time where you're just kind of coaxing through life, or trying to figure something out, or just being distracted each day, and you're not intentionally connecting to this only power source that's going to yield fruit, that's going to bring real life. And so that's the big takeaway that I take away from this. So what do you have to add on to that?
I really like the being connected thing, because I came up with a very similar idea. Is we not only are connected, and we think about ourselves as when we come to assembly or doing things like that as part of our connection, but I see this, he's talking more about direct relationship, personal relationship. And from this, in this section, I saw two things he's telling us. He's telling us that we have privileges, which is abiding in him. We have the privilege to be in a relationship with him that's unlike any other we can experience in our life. And secondly, we have responsibilities. It's bear that fruit. But we can't bear that fruit by just, as Zach was saying, okay, today I'm going to be humble. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. We have to bear the fruit by the connection and work on the connection, and the fruit just sort of, it seems, miraculously appears.
I think the challenge too is that the interconnectedness of this community. We're not just drawing from Jesus, but if you think about a vine, so those pesky vines that grew up on the side of your house, Josh. I used to power wash houses for a living, and those things were the bane of my existence because they don't come off. And they have a lot of strength, but they're really, really small, right? But their strength comes from their interconnectedness and how each part of that main branch connects itself to the support system and holds up the rest of it, and it's just this intertwined web of strength. The church, the body of believers as the vine, are the same thing. There are times where our job as the community is to help hold our brother connected to that vine because he has lost his strength, or he is going through pain or struggle, or just has lost his sight of the Father. There is times where it's always, I cannot hold myself up on the own. I have to have the vine and my fellow branches to keep me held up. We are not separate entities. And that is one thing that we have to be careful about in our culture when we read this imagery, because we just want to tend to focus on the one branch that is myself and my connectedness to the vine. And I think Jesus wants to challenge that, because the apostles who he's speaking to would not have seen it that way. They're looking out on an intertangled web of vines all connected to one another, drawing sustenance from the main branch, which is Jesus. That is the imagery of the church, is going out together, connecting with one another, holding one another up, giving each other grace and strength and love, and all of us working together towards the mission of bearing fruit by abiding and helping each other abide back in the Son.
You know, as we've talked through this, and this may not come out exactly in line with the story, but my personal experience watching my father as I was growing up as a farmer. And here's someone who was born in 1919, so from age 10 to age 26, he lived through Depression and World War and was poor, and all he had was land to raise things. And the things he was raising was food. And during the war, they were giving a good bit of that food to the army. But I bring that up to say I watched him, of course, as I was growing up, and when he as a farmer is taking care of crops and trees, he's living it. He wakes up thinking about it. He goes to bed thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And I look at that and say, isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? The only way we can do it is through Jesus, right? We have to abide with him and have that power. But our role is to wake up every morning thinking about people that don't know Jesus, and go to bed every night thinking about people that don't know Jesus. And in between, we're going out there and making sure that those crops, if you will, are being taken care of, being fed, and being nurtured.
I like that. Well, it was a good week. Thankfully, the next one that Marcus is going to tell us about, our next section of the passage in John, that continues with a lot of the same concepts that we've been going over, but even dives deeper. So I'm thankful for that, because I think if I would have turned these guys loose for another hour, we could have kept going. It's been really good being together. So Marcus, why don't you tell us a little bit about next week, and then close us out with a word of prayer.
Sure, and I will try to not keep us going for another hour, but Daryl leaves me in a place where I have to say something before the end. So I justify this by saying, next week, my section is going to be to continue in this passage of chapter 15. We're going to be going verse 9 on through the end of this kind of paragraph. But there's going to be a lot of the same themes. But I'll return to that here in a second. But I wanted to say, Daryl, that is exactly what I think about whenever I think about a thought that comes from this. In verse 8, it says that you bear much fruit and so prove to be my disciples in our ESV. Josh and I had a little conversation about this idea of so prove. It's not so much about the proving as it is. The word there is for becoming, for being. And the way that you be, the way that you abide, the way that you bear much fruit is exactly, I think, what you brought out in that idea of what your father was doing. That the entirety of his life, the rhythms of what he did every day, the things that were on his mind were those things that would cause him to continually abide. That is what abiding is. I naturally draw to that language of sustenance. We've been talking about how there's nutrients and there's this flow that exists in plants, but so it is too for us in our spiritual walks and spiritual lives. It very much matters, both what the rhythm of our life is, everything that we're thinking about needs to be centered around that, and two, that we're taking in the right things, that we're able to grow fruit that is natural to us. In Genesis, try not to keep this long, but we're told that we as humanity are made in the image and likeness of God. That imagehood never goes away. There is never a time where I will not be a branch that is in that vine, even if I'm separated from it in some sense. What we're trying to grow back into is that second part, the likeness. The likeness is that fruit that we want to produce. And so we'll talk more about that next week. We talked about the fruit of love a lot this week, and we'll continue along the progression in that nice little children's song that we're singing. We'll talk a little bit about joy. So be thinking this next week about what it is to have joy. Can indeed you have joy? How is it different from happiness or some other thing that you might think akin to it? But then also be thinking about how we're really going to, remain in the rest of those fruits as well. John, this later bit of this chapter is where we get that famous verse in verse 13 where it talks about greater love has no one than this. So read ahead, think about joy. And yeah, I would invite you to pray with me now as we close down this class and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Father in heaven, I want to thank you both for this time, for this day, for the light outside, for breath, and everything that we need to live, to move, and what's more, as we read today, to grow into becoming the kind of disciples that glorify you, bearing much fruit. And Father, I pray that we would struggle and strive for that connection to the vine, even the whole while as you bear us up so that we might be just as you desire us to be. Father, I want to thank you for those that are watching, for the communities and the people that they love, that support them, for us on stage as we love and support one another. Father, I thank you for placing each one in a time and in a place where you are working for our growth to glorify you. Father, I pray that you would bear us up, you would raise us up, you would drag us up. And Father, that in all humility we would turn our lives over to you. Help us to look to you for our sustenance, and we thank you again for all the blessings you give to us. It is in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit that we pray. Amen.